This is a Superman cape that my grandmother made for me when I was very little. As you can tell, I've been a fan for quite some time. Rather than starting with comic books, my comics literacy really began with watching movies and TV shows. I watched Saturday morning cartoons as a kid, which frequently featured characters from comic books. So before I actually bought my first comic, I was learning about them. The first comic I ever bought was for a series called Bone by Jeff Smith. I got the compiled trade paperbacks for Christmas, which collected all the single issues in one book, and I bought the single issues after that as they came out. I liked the trade paperbacks better because I got a whole story arc at once, rather than having to wait for months, sometimes years, to get the next installment. I didn't expand my collection beyond that until I got to college. Specifically, when I got a college job. At the time, I knew the characters I was interested in from the TV shows that I watched, but I didn't know where to start in terms of buying comic books. I liked Batman, but there were so many different titles publishing at once, and all of them part of a bigger story, that I didn't even know where to start. Trade paperbacks were a good way to get around this, since they compiled all the different single issues into one coherent story, so I didn't miss anything. This led me to not buy as many comics from here as I did from here. Another problem to getting into comics was historical continuity. There had been decades of history and storylines that I felt like I had to be in on to completely understand what was going on, to get the full experience. Comics also rebooted and retconned their continuity when they changed history after the fact, which sometimes made the history even harder to keep up with. One of Marvel's answers to the continuity barrier was to start a new line of comics that hit the reset button. Ultimate Spider-Man and the rest of the Ultimate line of comics were set in a parallel universe where all the familiar elements from the main Marvel universe were present, but only just starting out. Everyone who was interested now had an opportunity to get in on the ground floor just as the story was beginning, and I was very interested. Now that I had my starting point and the money to fund it, I started collecting comics on a regular basis. I always enjoyed reading, but comics were just so much easier to get through. It took me a while to get through a good book, but I could rip through a good comic story in a single night. Granted, comic stories could be simplistic, but they could also be really sophisticated. Thanks to comics creators such as Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, and many others, comics weren't just about bright costumes punching each other anymore. I was curious about what else was out there. Collecting comics now became a hunt for what could be innovative and genuinely inspiring. From there, I became interested in how comics worked, how one goes about making comics, and maybe even how one might be able to make a living doing comics. This led me to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics and the different kinds of educational comics that were out there. When grad school came along and asked me to study something, I knew it had to be something I was interested in, so I started digging around comic scholarship to see what was available. Much to my surprise, the comic scholarship field is actually thriving. Some may look down on comics as childish, but there are a growing number of people who recognize that the comics medium is really useful as a medium of communication. I look forward to learning more about it in the future.